All right, let's continue. All right. All right. Wait. 1 second. Hold on. Just give me 1 second. Okay. Is it louder now? Is it clearer? Does it sound better? Or it's the same? Yeah, okay. Sound better, right? Yeah, I raised the laptop. So it's closer to me. Okay. All right. So here, just give you an example, right, of satisfaction and democracy in the EU. So the logic here is that, when you discuss satisfaction and democracy, right, sometimes you want to locate it in a particular state or a country, and then you want to explain how they understand satisfaction and democracy, what are the factors that may impact, right, on levels of satisfaction. So in the case of Hobart's discussion, it's dated now, okay? But the logic is that why do we still refer to it? Because Hobart's discussion highlights that it is measured via two different models of regime support, which is exactly what the conundrum related to satisfaction and democracy is. One is the output-oriented model, right? Which is what we've been discussing, like what you asked just now, right? About people being satisfied with democracy in terms of satisfaction with the government performance, right? So that was what you asked just now, the output-oriented model. And then the other one is the procedural model, right? So like what I highlighted to you, the people believe that democratization has occurred and they have confidence in the democratic institutions and processes. They feel that democracy, as opposed to authoritarianism or as opposed to communism, right, is actually better and will bring about benefits for everybody, right? So that means they're satisfied with the concept of implementing democracy, right? And they believe that their government is democratic in nature and they have support for it. So what you see in the sorry. What you see in the EU is interesting. Why? Because you've got two levels of or two approaches to individuals understanding being satisfied with democracy. So the rationale is that they have satisfaction or not with the EU institutions. And then subsequently, they also have satisfaction or not with their domestic governments, right? So this is an interesting way to look at things, right? So, the rationale here is that satisfaction in democracy, as according to Hobart, right, was seen to be quite high. Over half of them in 2012 were actually quite satisfied with how democracy works in the EU. And this was interesting. Why? Because there was this rationale that there is actually, a collective identity. Because at the end of the day, right, each of these individuals, they come from different countries, right? So there are actually differences among all of these different countries. Yes, they are all ruled by EU institutions, but they also come from, let's say, different cultures, different demographics, from different countries like, Germany versus France versus, in those days, UK, so on, right? So there was generally across the board, they did feel that when they did the survey, they did find out that citizens felt a strong support for the performance, for EU institutions, right? But then the last point, can you please underline the last point on this finding? This is why it's interesting. Just because, I mean, we use this as a basis for understanding. In this particular study, it was found that there was, high knowledge of EU institutions. At that point in 2012, when they did that study, they felt that they found out that citizens were satisfied. And remember, we talked about civic culture, citizens being oriented towards institutions and expressing support for these democratic institutions and their leaders, correct? But the logic here is that we cannot assume that it is going to be linear. That means it moves in a unilinear direction. It doesn't mean that once people have established civic culture and once people have expressed satisfaction with democracy, that they are continuously going to be satisfied with democracy, right? They say civic culture is present, right? And civic culture means you understand the institutions, you believe that they're legitimate, you are oriented towards it. You have a high level of knowledge about the institutions. The more knowledge you have of the institutions and being satisfied now means you will then have higher levels of expectation, correct? So the logic is that the institutions may be functioning in the same way. It means the institutions didn't experience a fallback or a slide. It means how they were functioning optimally in 2012, 2015 when you assess them, right? They're still functioning optimally. But because citizens already experienced that high level of satisfaction then, and the institutions are functioning the same way, but they're not experiencing more and more benefits because it's like they've already experienced a lot of benefits already, but they're not experiencing more and more benefits. So then institutions may be performing very well. There's a high level of civic culture, but citizens may start to feel dissatisfied because they are now setting higher and higher and higher standards of performance. Right? You understand the logic, right? It's like this, You, for example, I give you an example. Very, very low layman, very simple example. You score 90 marks for your exam. Example. You bring back your exam, what result slip, you show your parents. You score 90 marks for your exam. And then next exam, you score 90 marks again. Next exam, you score 91 marks. Next exam, you score 92 marks. Next exam, you score 90 marks. You already hit that 90 and you're doing very well, but your parents are unhappy. Why? Why you only score 90? How come you didn't score 95? How come you didn't score 100? I think one time or another in our lives, some of us may have experienced this, right? You already hit that high level, but the expectations are high. And when you continuously deliver the same, your parents or maybe people around you are like, how come you didn't score higher and higher? You understand what I mean? Do you understand the lot? Ah, correct. Yes, Lionel. They expect the institutions to improve further or to provide better, to deliver better, right? Even though the standards are already quite good, right? So they become more critical. That's the rationale. Lionel, I understand? Right. So they become more critical, more demanding. But it's already high levels, but they expect higher and higher and higher levels. So that means institutions may be working well, but citizens are dissatisfied. So again, there's a nuance down here. So remember just now you asked me, oh, is it non-democracies? Therefore, you jump to a conclusion, right? We jump to conclusion, say, oh, maybe non-democracies function better, or this particular Western democracy, if it's a democratic country and very high on the democratic index. The very high democratic index means you've got very strong institutions, correct? Because the protection of political and civil liberties is there, correct? Am I right? So already strong institutions, right? But you still can have low levels of satisfaction. So now you understand why I said just now that just because the democratic rankings, the democratic index is not directly correlated to satisfaction with democracy. Remember what I said just now? Right, the point that I made. Everybody clear on this? People? Hello? Okay? Understand? Everybody understand? Okay. All right. Okay. Then what I did was I've given you an update. Okay. So you find that things can change. Remember just now I mentioned in light of the coronavirus pandemic, right? Our citizens respond to the way state institutions have responded to the virus, to the pandemic, right? So, sorry. Okay, so we've got two different, reports for you there. Take a look at it, right? So what happens is that it was quite interesting. Um, what happens is that in some years, right, when you look at the barometer, the Eurobarometer survey, right, in other surveys, right, you will see that there's a dip in um, in satisfaction. Say, for example, between 2009 and 2013 in particular, there was a fall in trust, right, in the European Union, right? And it was a case where there was, a lot of populist movements, high levels of Euroscepticism, rise of the far right, and so on, right? So these were some, kinks, right, that occurred that damaged satisfaction of democracy. But there was also, a scenario where citizens were dissatisfied with the way certain issues were being handled, like, say, for example, immigration, refugee and asylum seekers, and so on, migration, right? So there was dissatisfaction with democracy and fall in support because EU citizens were thinking, that there's a difficulty in uh, coming up with common solutions to common EU problems. And this dissatisfaction in EU, right, was typically fueled by two major things. One, economic insecurity. So there was high levels of unemployment, slow growth. Look at the time period 2009 2013, coming out of the global economic crisis, like the US hedge fund, right, crisis, and so on, right? So around that period and subsequently, so economic insecurity as a result of unemployment, slow growth, low wages, stagnant wages, and as a result of this austerity measures the governments took, fears of things like IT robotization, people being replaced by robots and e-government, right? And then the other one that caused this dissatisfaction was cultural backlash, right? Like immigration, like your refugee and asylum seekers, terrorist threats, right? And then you also had this scenario where Islam and other cultures, right? But Islam was noted to be one of the fastest growing religions in Europe, right? I think the top three religions, you had a increasing secularization amongst. Secularization means people stop believing in religion or stop participating in religious practices, stop relying on religion, right? So you had an increasing level of secularization. There were some people who were, like church attendance was dropping, but concurrently, you saw Islam becoming more and more popular. And then among the, the purists or the orthodox or the conservatives, they saw this as a threat to the culture of Europe, right? So you have this combination of factors that led to a fall in support. And then things changed, right? And then now when you see what's it, reports, right? Say, looking at the coronavirus pandemic and so on, two or three of the reports that looked at over the last 2 to 3 years, two years or so, right, is that trust in the EU remains stable, right? The Europeans generally they feel that there is the way that the EU institutions have and their domestic governments have handled the pandemic, right, um, has actually they're quite optimistic about it, right? They trust that the EU institutions will make right decisions in the future, right? And there's a high level of competence, right, among the EU institutions, so they're quite optimistic. And they also realize, I think partly also some of this is also fueled by looking at the troubles that UK has faced since Brexit, and then they feel that okay, we're actually better off being in the EU, and a lot of decisions are being taken care of, a lot of issues are being taken care of. We're not experiencing the same level of troubles like the UK is experiencing since Brexit, right? So that probably has also fueled, right, levels of satisfaction. So you've got to think about, remember, and why I spent a bit of time explaining this is that the context, right? The context in 2009 to 2013, the economic crisis, rising levels of immigration, the logic of fears over cultural dilution as a result of immigration to Europe. These kinds of things affected citizen satisfaction. The way the pandemic is handled affects citizen satisfaction, right? So it is the context. That's why I highlighted to you at the very beginning. Satisfaction and democracy means different things to different people because we're experiencing it differently. Understand? Okay, all clear? Right? So that's why the EU example is a good example to then the reports are good, to pay attention to, because you want to, understand where does this connection come from, right? Okay, all right. So that is what I wanted to highlight to you. Okay, all right. Let's move on. Some of the subsequent slides, may be a bit repetitive, right? Because it runs around the same argument again and again. So I may go fast on certain slides because we've already kind of discussed it already. Wait, drink water. Okay, right. So when you look at some of these um, reports, or no, sorry, not reports, surveys, right? Surveys like say those that are used by the CSES project, the Comparative Study of Electoral System, is look at the question. On the whole, are you very satisfied, fairly satisfied, not very satisfied, or not at all satisfied with the way democracy works in your country? Somebody tell me, what is problematic with these questions? What is problematic with this question? Somebody tell me. Anyone? Yeah. When you say it's vague, there's no room for nuance. What is actually the meaning of fairly satisfied? What's the difference between fairly satisfied and not very satisfied? Correct. Yeah, meaning is different for different people, correct? But my main quibble is that fairly satisfied means you're kind of satisfied, but you're kind of not satisfied. Not very satisfied also means you're kind of satisfied, but you're not very satisfied. Maybe fairly satisfied means you're more satisfied than dissatisfied. Whereas not very satisfied means you're more dissatisfied than satisfied. But how to put a number? Ah, right. How do I decide on a scale of 1 to 5? What does 5 actually mean? How does 5 differ from 4? Right. So how reliable are all of these surveys? Correct. It's like, those crazy Facebook surveys. Do you see a butterfly or do you see a lady standing there? And if you see a lady standing there means you like white bread. And if you see a butterfly standing there means you like pancakes. Correct. So the rationale is that how do we come to these conclusions based on all of these surveys with very vague questions, all these vague questions, and in the first place, are people answering these questions right based on their understanding? Are they satisfied with ideals underpinning notion of democracy? Or when they say they're satisfied, are they talking about are they satisfied with government of the day? So in the first place, already got one problem there. Is it number one or number two that they're answering? Second problem, what do they understand the difference between fairly satisfied and not very satisfied? Can you see? So this is where it becomes very problematic. Okay, so Emerson highlighted. Okay, there's one central dimension we can think about. Is that this? Where are we talking about the support for diffuse support for fundamental beliefs and values in that society? Or are we talking about specific support on particular benefits? The government give me GST voucher or not? I'm satisfied. Government did not give me GST voucher because I stay in a condo or because my household income is very high compared to somebody else. Therefore, I didn't get a GST voucher or my GST voucher is smaller. I'm not happy. And then that person is not satisfied. Right? So it can be different things. Okay. Just now remember uh, in the chat, there was this, I mentioned this idea about the splitting hairs. Remember? Then you say that whether it's the government of the day or whether it's the political system, right? Then I say I want to address that in a very structured manner. Remember that earlier on? Remember I mentioned that? Right? Okay, so this is what I was talking about, right? So I like this framework. Okay, that's why I highlighted it and I say it's useful. This one, I would say, good to use in the exam, right? Why? Because you can use this to say that, okay, this framework helps us to better understand what people actually mean when they say to satisfy democracy. Okay, so let's look at it. Norris, right, detailed 5 different levels of the political system on the continuum. So this one allows you to think in a more nuanced manner. Exactly what aspect are you satisfied with or dissatisfied with? So at the broadest level to the most specific. So number 1 is the broadest level. Number 5, which is on the next slide, is the most specific. Yeah, is the most specific. Okay? Okay. So number 1, political community. That means the entire political landscape, civic culture, right? Is that orientation? Do we as individuals feel an attachment to the political system? Do we feel that we are part of this political system and we can make an impact on this political system? Number 2, regime principles, right? Is it the case of democratic rule, right? Is an ideal democratic rule is being implemented, whether it's flawed democracy and so on, right? Or whether it is weak institutions and so on. So what are the principles of that particular regime, and do we support it or not? Right? That means, like, do we support the kinds of institutions, democratic institutions that exist in Singapore? Are we satisfied with the way elections are being run and our approach to, say, remaining as a one dominant party system as opposed to trying to shift to a two-party system, right? Because that's been addressed recently in the media again, it has come up, right, over the last couple of weeks. Number three, regime performance. So in this case, when we talk about regime, we're talking about, that particular, the government of the day. Okay, so that's how you understand regime performance. So regime performance, support for the regime, right? Performance refers to support for how the regime is working at a particular moment of time. So in this particular moment, how is the government of the day dealing with economic crisis? How's the government of the day dealing with the pandemic? How's the government of the day dealing with GST hike, or dealing with transport fee hike, or dealing with vaccinations, right? Okay. Or as a particular, aspect of performance. Number four, the institutions itself, right? So say for example, um, you know, do we feel that, say, the office of the president is functioning well? Do we feel that the judiciary is fair? Do we feel that the judiciary is representative of the demographics in the country, right? Or do we feel that the judiciary is full of judges that have been appointed by particular political master and therefore are not neutral and not impartial, but they are politicized? Do we feel that electoral department, that means the, the electoral commission, has that been politicized, right? Or not politicized, is very fair, it's independent, right? So support for those particular institutions, right? Support for the parliament, okay? And lastly, support for the political actors, right? So, this is the very specific dimension. Do you support a particular person, or do you support a particular party? Do you, have great support for the institutions, as well as this, person who is serving as president, for instance? So the logic here is that on a scale of 1 to 5, you can have a more nuanced understanding. So, for example, somebody, right, say for example, an American citizen, right, may have attachment to the political system. They may believe, right, that generally the principles in their country, like in America, right, it is working towards democracy, or it is democratic in nature. But they may not have support for the person who's serving as president. So they're not saying that their country is not democratic, or they do not like the government of the day, but they do not like the individual who's serving as president. So there may be people who believe in the ideals of democracy, and they may be Democrats, but they preferred Bernie Sanders to Biden. Or there may be others who believe that their country is democratic, but they don't support the political actor that is in power right now, and they say that Trump is the real, individual, the real deal, right? And they support Trump instead. So you can support a particular aspect, one of these, right, and yet not support the other. I can support Trump, but I believe that democracy has eroded. Or I can support Biden and say democracy is strong. And I can support Biden and say Biden has done very well in comparison to Trump. Or I can support the political institutions and say Biden has gone ahead and destroyed the economy, destroyed the environment by signing all of those deals, for drilling pipes and all of these things. So this can be a combination. I can have high level of civic culture. I believe the institutions are strong, but I don't support the individual. You understand? Now do you understand why this is a better way to look at the logic of the government of the day versus the political system and so on? Clear? Just now, in the chat. A couple of you were talking about it. Understand? Previous survey also cannot assist government where to improve. Why not? Why not? The survey can be an indicator, can be a general indicator. You see, that I'll come to that in a little while. The survey may not be 100% accurate. Yeah. Correct. The vague one, right? Okay. So hold on. Annabelle, wait. I will come to that. I'm going to address it. Wait first. Okay. So the logic here, right, is that let me answer Yen Yu's question first. The survey can assist government to improve. Why? Because even if it is flawed, even if it's vague, right? Okay, it still is a rough indicator. Generally, are people happy or unhappy? Same thing with Annabelle's question. Why do we measure it if the process of measuring is flawed, right? Because it does give us some kind of indicator. It doesn't mean every single measuring process is entirely flawed. Depends on how the questions are phrased. Like your exam question. Exam question can be very specific or can be very ambiguous, right? But it's still an exam question, correct? Then you cannot say exam question is very challenging, ambiguous. Why even test me? Or let me write my own explanation of the theory. Correct. But the logic is that it really depends on how the surveys are phrased, what kind of questions are being asked, how genuine the questions actually are, and how genuinely people answer the questions. Yes, so it can be a general indicator. Remember what I said earlier on. Governments realize that they cannot make decisions behind closed doors without suffering the consequences subsequently. So it's still necessary. I'm going to come to the explanation in a little while. Okay? All right? Okay, hold on. All right? Annabelle, you hold on to your question, okay? All right? Okay, so this one is just, a question for you to think about, right? Related to Annabelle's question, actually. Okay, let me answer this. Annabelle, isn't this your question down here? Useful to assess or not? Annabelle? Yeah. So I told you I'll address it, right? As I said, don't jump. Huh? All of y'all, huh? But you see, no, don't say sorry. I like these questions, you know why? It tells me, number one, you all are paying attention to what I'm saying. Correct. Because if you're not listening, then you wouldn't ask me this question. And number two, you understood what I was saying, meaning that there's so much problems, right, associated with measuring, meaning that you understand that there are problems associated with measuring, correct? But I have an answer for this lah. That's why I say don't jump. When I say don't jump means we are going to deal with the problem. Okay, but it's a good question because you're correct. Why do we measure it out? Actually, Annabelle's question can even be a potential exam question. Right? Why do we measure satisfaction democracy if the process of measuring is flawed? Why does this topic even exist? Why are we sitting down talking about it for the last 2 hours? Well, 1.5 hours. Right. Annabelle, please don't say sorry. What am I going to do? Delete that. Okay. All right. So the point here is this. Okay. There have been a debate between all of these different theorists, right? That there are so many difficulties in understanding satisfaction with democracy and measuring it. So there's a debate within political science as to how useful actually it is to assess. So it's unclear, like Lind and Ekman, right? They say, what we don't even know what we're measuring, right? So how to measure, right? So the respondent can be just vindictive and saying that because they didn't experience personal growth or economic growth and therefore they're dissatisfied with democracy. And also remember, like what I highlighted to you earlier on, remember that very well performing institution sorry very well performing institutions in EU, and that you know can still bring about high levels of dissatisfaction because people are expecting more and more, higher expectations, but it's already doing so well already. Well, how much more you want to do better? But people are still expecting better and better. Right? So the logic here, right, is that just because people are expressing dissatisfaction, it doesn't automatically imply that the entire system is going to crumble and you're going to have revolution, right? It can be a case that there's high level of satisfaction and people want to change the way things work and there's going to be a revolution and riots and so on. But it also can mean that just people are just expressing their dissatisfaction, and yeah, it's a warning sign, correct? And that it keeps the government on toes. But it doesn't mean that people are going to go onto the streets and say, down, down with government, right? So it's a warning sign. So it doesn't automatically, important point is here, right? It doesn't automatic, underline, please underline. It may not automatically imply that there is a threat to the stability of democracy. So, like I said, this is why we cannot jump to conclusions, right? Okay. So, the case, it can be, simply voters are not satisfied with the policy response or they're just unhappy with a particular politician. Say, for example, during this, I go back to the COP again, okay? All right. During the COP, there was dissatisfaction expressed in a lot of social media platforms with the way one particular member on the committee kept or actually two. There were two members on the committee. I shall not say who, but if you were watching, if you're watching the COP videos and all of these things, right? There were two particular individuals that netizens kept pointing out. Why are they responding like that? Why they sound so arrogant? Why they not waiting for the way the why they not waiting for responses from the defendants and so on, right? So it could be a particular unhappiness with one particular politician. Unhappiness, say for example, a lot of people express unhappiness with Raisa Khan. Okay, this one I can mention because she got fined already, right? So I can mention, right? I will mention Raisa. I don't want to argue about it, but just say there are a lot of citizens who express unhappiness with Raisa Khan because they say that okay, she was found to be lying in parliament. But does that mean that they were dissatisfied with opposition per se? Was just one particular politician, correct? Does that mean that, say, for example, dissatisfaction with, say, the way the East Coast plan was described in the G2020 hustings? Did that translate into unhappiness or dissatisfaction with the incumbent political party altogether? I mean, people made a joke and a meme out of it. Unfortunately, the poor man, right? The East Coast plan, and up till today, 2 years already, right? People still talking about East Coast plan, right? But does that mean that they are unhappy with the policy response, or unhappy with the politician per se, or unhappy with the government per se, right? So it's like one particular element. It doesn't mean that everything is gone down the drain, right? So the logic is that these things are not interchangeable, right? It can be different elements. Okay, so then go on to this idea, right? What does it means, right? So I'm not going to go through this because we've already mentioned this already, right? Okay, so all the different studies by all of these different theories highlight that when they look at satisfaction of democracy, they're measuring different things. What is it related to? Okay, so I'm not going to go through this slide because I've mentioned it before already. But at the end of the day, right, what they highlight is that because there are so many nuances, it is interpreted so widely, and they measure so many different things, and they could mean so many different things. Like what Annabelle asked just now, right? The measuring is flawed in the sense that you could get so many different answers, or your answers that you get could mean so many different things. So they say that when you use any of these surveys and when you use any of these measurements, we have to understand that they are flawed, right? Or they are problematic. Maybe maybe, Annabelle, flawed is like a very strong word. Maybe we can say that they are quite problematic, right? And there are discrepancies or there are deficiencies. Say flawed, right? It sort of says that everything is wrong. So I would say, there are several problems associated with measuring satisfaction and democracy. There are a lot of discrepancies, okay? And there are flaws in terms of empirical measures. So the flaws in the measures, right? So these flaws lead to the discrepancies. You understand? You understand? You can use the word flaws, lah, right? You can use the word, but sometimes, I like to soften the argument a little bit sometimes, to prevent getting into trouble. Okay, so what they eventually come to conclusion is that when you do use them, they should be exercised or interpreted with extreme caution. That means we have to take it with a pinch of salt. Cannot use these sweeping generalizations. You understand? Right? So you can't just say, oh, there's a dip in satisfaction democracy. That means everything, is unstable. People are very unhappy. It's going to equal to a riot. And, non-democracies are performing better. You cannot do this equal equation, and come to this random conclusion, right? So what they do say is this, right? They say that, okay, fine. There are flaws. There are problems associated with it, a lot of discrepancies. But no matter how, at the end of the day, like what Lionel said just now, where's Lionel's comment here? Lionel's comment, where is it? It's a warning sign, right? Lionel's comment says it's a warning sign. It's a warning about what people actually feel. So that means, at the end of the day, it's still an examination of citizens' attitudes. And an examination of citizens' attitudes is a measure. It's an indicator of what people feel. We may not be able to know exactly what they're referring to, but generally we know. Are they happy or are they unhappy? And then we dig deeper, right? And we find out what are they unhappy about. So these general surveys or these measurements can be a stepping stone, right? To understanding, okay, if people saying that they're dissatisfied, okay, we know people are unhappy, right? Okay, let's find out now. Exactly what are they unhappy about? Number two, who is unhappy? That means everybody is unhappy. Only the old are unhappy. Only the old from the dominant ethnic group are unhappy. Only the young from the minority ethnic group are unhappy. Only the well-educated are unhappy. Only the people who are closer to the poverty line are unhappy. So that is a stepping stone, right? So that is still an examination of citizens' attitudes. Number two, even though there are discrepancies, maybe since we are looking at it in such a nuanced way, right? That means I say, who exactly is unhappy? What are they unhappy about? Or what are they happy about? Then, in that case, they can be useful for a single country qualitative case study. Instead of looking at 50 countries, right? And find and a quantitative study and saying that across all of these 50 countries, people are generally dissatisfied with democracy. But in these 50 countries, different people understand democracy and understand institutions in different ways. How are you going to get accurate answer? But if I only look at satisfaction democracy only in Singapore, only in Malaysia, then I can identify better. Annabelle, does this answer your question now? Right? Why do we still measure even though the process of measuring is flawed? Does that answer your question? So that means the acknowledgement that there may be discrepancies, there may be problems associated with it, but it is still useful. Correct? Answers the question, right? Right? Okay? Cognitive diffusion, DIFF, right? DIFFUSION. Meaning there's different understanding. You can relate it to that, right? But I would think about I would rather than to go there, right? I would just restrict my argument to explaining this about how it is useful for single country qualitative case studies and so on. Okay, everybody understand? Any questions so far? All clear? So this is a very important part in understanding the topic, understanding why we should measure satisfaction democracy in the first place. Of course, in your exam answer, you will summarize all of this. But I cannot summarize because I need to explain to you first. Otherwise, we'll get questions like what Amanda asked. So Annabelle asked. The Norris framework is used to assess the satisfaction. Yeah, it is a better way to assess satisfaction. For me, I feel yes, correct. Amanda, okay? It's a more nuanced way. It's a more nuanced way. Okay? All right. Okay. So then, okay, let's look at the patterns with satisfaction. Right? So we're coming to the main arguments, of the next section already. Right? So publics around the globe today, right? You realize that people are quite dissatisfied. But you realize that, people are dissatisfied with democracy, right? Meaning that they're not saying that they want to go back to non-democratic structures. When people say they're dissatisfied, the discontent, right, among a lot of people today is what? They're dissatisfied with the way democracy is working in their country. And they believe that, there's their discontent, right? Discontent. It stems from major elements: angered political elites, economic dissatisfaction, changes that occur that will affect them. When people are angry at political elites, why are they angry at political elites? Why are they angry that politicians are corrupt? What makes them angry about corrupt politicians? A lot of it has to do with distribution, access to resources. A lot has to do with perceptions of fairness. A lot has to do with the fact that people feel that politicians are abandoning them, lining their own pockets, using public office to further their own personal agenda rather than protect people. So it's a combination. You talk about your rights as an individual, or you talk about your ability to participate in politics, when you talk about economic dissatisfaction, they're all connected to each other, right? So this is where people are generally discontented, right? Because they feel that the current framework or the current economic socio-political situation doesn't protect them, right? So they feel that they're not being treated fairly. Politicians are out of touch with what the citizens want. Courts do not treat people fairly, right? People, and when people are satisfied, it's the opposite. They feel that democratic institutions work to protect their interests, work to protect their rights, work to, to, to distribute resources in an equitable manner across society, right? So that is largely what it hinges on when we talk about discontent. It's important to write in your exam answer the basis of this discontent. Okay? So I've given you the 2019, statistics, and I've also given you the link to the newer one, the 2021. Dissatisfaction is up. Why is dissatisfaction up? Right? Basically, what has been the problem associated with it? Okay, I'm going to share screen with you now, okay, because I want to show you the report, right? Okay, hold on. Now, later on, you go and click on the report, read it yourself. Very easy to read. I love Pew's research reports because they're so straightforward. Okay, let me share screen with you. Okay, hold on. Now, can you see? Right. So, negative economic views, largely, right, are linked to the dissatisfaction that you're seeing now, right? So when you look at the report is broken up, right? it shows you, okay, a lot of them are dissatisfied with democracy. Can you see in some countries the blue is very big compared to the green, right? In other countries, say like Sweden, Netherlands, and so on, right? They're satisfied with the way democracy is working. But in other countries, Greece, in Italy, UK, not satisfied, right? Where's the US? US also quite high, 59 versus 39%, right? Okay, and then there's a general trend. Dissatisfaction with how democracy is working since 2018 is actually increased, right? Okay, so percentage of them, who are not satisfied is also changed. Okay, right? Then you go on to see this other part here. Opinions with how democracy is working associated with economic assessment. This is government performance, right? Okay, so people who say economy is doing poorly are more dissatisfied with the functioning of democracy, right? Okay, can you see? Can you see? And then also they're thinking about long-term economic future, right? So those who are pessimistic, obviously they are dissatisfied with democracy. People who say, what's going to happen to my children subsequently, right? Like, climate change, climate change affecting economy being affected, by pandemic and so on. Frustration in political elites also tied with dissatisfaction, right? So, people who feel that they're corrupt politicians or officials who don't care about average citizens. You're not accountable to me. You're not listening to what I'm saying. I mean, as in, people feel that the politicians are not listening to what they're saying, right? Like elected officials don't care about what ordinary people are thinking. They're likely to be dissatisfied. Can you see? All right. Okay, so I'm going to stop sharing. It's my journals. Okay. So can you see? Everybody understand? Right? Okay, how to look at these different the statistics and so on. Okay. All right. Okay, all clear? So take a look at the report, right? Okay. Now, let's look at okay, I've given you several other reports, right? There's some others from Global Satisfaction Democracy, Cambridge University, right? Some other reports, saying that where are they satisfied? So in what regions, as a result of what, right? This one is interesting. I wanted to highlight this to you, right? When citizens feel that government is sharing power, right? When that means democracy is working well, right? There's a power sharing mechanism. There is proportional representation. People have a say in the way policies are being formulated, right? And people, tend to vote, and they have got high voter turnout and so on. It leads to high levels of satisfaction. So shared political power with citizens, does tend to make citizens happier. Those, where there is a lack of diffusion of political power, that means concentration of political power in authoritarian governments, it tends to lead to lower citizen satisfaction. Doesn't automatically mean that authoritarian countries have got lower levels of citizen satisfaction. Like I mentioned to you just now, some reports, right, highlight that some countries like China and Russia, they have a different perception of how institutions work and whether government is delivering or not, right? So you can also see high levels of satisfaction with institutions in non-democratic countries, or authoritarian governments, or countries that have got strong concentration of political power. So it can go both ways, right? Okay, but generally, we do see that the trend is that yes, this shared political power, does make citizens more happy at the end of the day. Okay, this one is from your subject guide, right? And it just gives you an assessment that this is dated, right? That's why I gave you the new reports to look at, right? Because just relying on the subject guide alone, and the examples from there alone, it doesn't always help us, right? So we need to look at both sets of examples, use the subject guide as a stepping stone, okay? And then what I like about this figure here, it's very interesting. Yet, how can you trust reports from authoritarian countries that saying that their citizens are happy? It depends on, say, for example, who is releasing the report. Yet the truth is, right, how can we trust any kind of report from anywhere? Correct? Right? But sometimes what happens is that some of these reports, surveys that are done by NGOs or independent institutions and so on. So that's why I told you, I always tell you, right, all of these surveys and reports taken with a pinch of salt, right? And the logic is that you combine it with other indicators. Do you see upheaval? Do you see riots, right? Do you see a general fear? Do you see how people utilize social media, for instance, right? So it's a combination of these different things. Okay, all right. So of course lah. If say the political party itself releases a report and say my citizens are very happy with me, I cannot trust. How can I trust? Correct. Yeah. Does that answer your question? Huh? These are all of these at the end of the day, right? All of these reports are just general barometers, right? They're just general standards. We always have to take them with a pinch of salt. Let me come to this. The Russian one is very interesting, right? Because you look at it, compared to everybody else, Russia says that very small portion of people say that democracy is very good for governing a country. A bigger portion of people say fairly good. A very big portion of people, in comparison to everybody else, say is fairly bad. And the purple one, they say very bad, right? In for the Russia case, that that column is the biggest compared to all the other countries. So it is quite indicative, right? Different attitudes, right? Okay. Okay. So it's by the World Value Survey. World Value Survey, yeah, like just now you asked the question, right? World Value Survey is generally considered to be quite neutral. Generally considered to be quite neutral. Okay. All right. So let's look at this one down here. All right. So generally, this is some of the ideas that you cull from, looking at the statistics, right? I'm not going to go through this, right? But what the interesting one is the Russian case, right? So you look at some of these reports that I've given you. I've also given you an additional PDF, right, on popular support for democracy and autocracy. It's uploaded in eGlobal together with a set of lecture notes. They're very interesting. I like this figure because it highlights to you, right, that the different perspectives. So, say for example, 46%. Look at the graphic on the screen, right? 46%, right, say that a special kind of democracy in line with Russia's traditions and mindset is required. Why? Because they've not experienced democracy in the same way that other countries have experienced, right? As a result of being, under non-democratic rule for a very long period of time. And the logic also is that when we talk about democracy, right, and we ask people in Russia, do you believe that there should be the same kind of, do you believe in democracy? Should we implement it? And their logic is that yes, we believe in democracy, but it is not the kind of democracy that we see in the US. It doesn't apply, right? It's a different type of democracy that we require, right? It's not just US democracy that is democracy considered to be democracy, right? So there are a lot of issues associated with understanding, right, how people want democratic structures. Say like we read the PDF, right, on popular support for democracy and autocracy. It is not like people don't understand what democracy is about in Russia, but they highlight they do not want corrupt administrative officials. They do not want corrupt government either. They know what they want, right? But they want a nuanced approach to democracy. So take a look at that. It's a very interesting report, right? And what also you need to think about, right, is that previous experience, right? One of their most liberal governments under who was it? Yeltsin. Yeltsin, the most liberal of all leaders was Yeltsin. Economics for economic reforms for market freedom and such a Western ideas that they basically embraced right during that period, or at least an emulation of Western ideas, basically turned to chaos. So some of these Russians basically look at that period and say, okay, we are used to. They actually used this phrase in one of the interviews, right? They say that Russians basically we cannot be ruled with the carrot. We can only be ruled by the stick. There's a need for order and discipline. What priorities are required for day-to-day life, right? So that is an interesting indicator. So take a look at these reports, right? This is an additional thing for you to think about, right? Okay. But when you look at this also, right, looking at, how, 46% of them say that, they need a special kind of democracy. A large portion say, we do not want, democracy with their own characteristics to suit, to suit the context, right, better than, you cannot just have a framework that you impose on them, right? You will see that you would basically see that there's a high level of dissatisfaction, right, with democracy, as what you saw in the earlier report down here, right, this one here. Okay, but when you look at this, the CSES survey, right, there's a lot of variations, right? Russia basically has a score of 3 according to the CSES survey, right? Which, according to the World Values Survey, a lot of people say that democracy is very bad and it's not, something that is, they're not satisfied with, democracy. So the rationale is that, when you look at different surveys, like what Ian asked just now, when I mentioned all of these surveys have to be taken with a pinch of salt. Logic is that these surveys are also not indicative. They're not standard. Different surveys, depending on what kind of questions are being asked, who they're asking, how many people they are interviewing. Say like for example, in Singapore, right? They say, oh, transport survey indicates that people are very satisfied with the way the transport system is working in the country. Have you ever been surveyed? I've never been surveyed before. Every time we see surveys being reported in the newspaper saying that citizen satisfaction is an all-time high for XYZ industry and so on. Who are they surveying? How are they carrying out the survey? This is what leads us to different kinds of results and scores, right? According to different surveys. So according to the CSES, it's not so bad in Russia. But according to World Values Survey, things look quite bad in Russia. Right? You understand the difference here? All right, what we're trying to point out. Okay. All right. Okay. So, the rationale is that this is just an explanation, right? Is that in general, what you want to think about, right, is that in many countries, in many surveys, at the end of the day, the results are always based on performance. Citizens always respond, right, when they are talking about whether they're satisfied, right? The basis is always performance, right? Okay, so that's basically what the Wagner study basically highlights. Okay, let's come to this. Today I will only do number 1 and number 2, right? Okay, number 3 and number 4 I'll explain next week. If I don't have enough time, I'll only do number 1. Okay, because next week I still have time. I purposely set it like that because next week I'm going to do exam prep, right? So today I likely will do number 1. If I have time, I'll do number 2. Otherwise, next week I'll do number 2, 3, and 4. Okay, all right. Arguments actually are very simple, all right? Okay, but I still feel the need to explain to you. So first one, okay, cultural values and the age of democracy. Okay, so basically, the argument here is that does cultural values of a region, does that influence the level of satisfaction? Say like what we saw in Russia, right? They're like what Lionel mentioned, right? Russia's characteristics or the environment in which all of this exists and so on, right? So how does that influence level of satisfaction? Very simple also. Let's look at, remember as I mentioned, Huntington and the different civilizations, right? So remember the Clash of Civilizations thesis, right? What he highlighted was that those that come from the Western civilizations, those that have Western culture, Western values, Christian tradition, right? They basically understand and what democracy is. Democracy can take root in these states, right? And therefore, based on this logic, right, citizens and countries with this particular culture, Western values, Christian tradition, as opposed to, those that lack democratically compatible cultures, you know, will have higher levels of satisfaction with democracy because they understand democracy and they will be therefore satisfied with ideals and institutions of democracy. Those who come from countries, right, that do not have any kind of compatibility between their culture with democracy, right, they're not going to experience satisfaction. So this is the theory, right? And it's not just the Western theories that highlight this. Earlier on, right, in the 1980s and early 1990s even, we used to have these Asian values. I'm quite sure you all have heard of it. Asian values basically was used as a framework, right, and as an excuse to justify non-democratic structures in a lot of Southeast Asian and East Asian countries, right? So saying that East Asian countries and Southeast Asian countries that are Confucianist, Confucian, not confusion, Confucian, Confucian based, right? Or have particular values that place society above self, right? So they're paternalistic, they prioritize order over consensus, uh, you know, uh, and they don't prioritize individualism, they prioritize family. You're not looking at the individual, rights, but you're basically looking at what is best for the whole of society and so on, right? So Asian cultures were seen wrongly as embodying values that tolerate, endorse non-democratic structures over democratic norms, right? Since then, the Asian values argument has gone out the window already, right? It is no longer something that is popular or very, accepted. Very few theorists, and governments actually rely on the Asian values argument anymore, right? So also, you look at this idea here, right? Sorry, I accidentally duplicated the slide. Sorry, I mistaken. I was going to delete that slide off. So what you need to see, right, is that the Asian values argument, right, or these cultural values was seen as a scenario where they were trying to justify power, right? They were trying to highlight that these kinds of scenarios, they're not compatible with democracy, but it's not true. Confucianism is compatible with democracy. Where do we see this idea that putting society above self requires a non-democratic structure, right? And also, is everybody in East Asia and Southeast Asia, culturally homogeneous, right? So you can't say that everybody subscribes to Confucianism. It's not a satisfactory explanation at all to explain the lack of democratic commitment, right? So this is just like excuses and justifications used by these non-democratic leaders. So generally, what you just want to highlight, right, is when you look at these kinds of statistics, right? Of course, yeah, in countries that you know have got the most highest levels of satisfaction, generally, advanced democracies of the developed world, right? They are generally, the strongest believers in democracy and so on, right? Newer democracies like Eastern Europe countries, some in Asia, and so on, a bit more ambivalent. But is the logic, why are they ambivalent? Can we reduce it down to just one factor to say that culture is the one that prevents them from being compatible with democracy. Remember, we already chucked this argument out of the window in the democracy lecture itself, right? Culture doesn't stand in the way of the growth of democratic institutions. It is the way culture is being interpreted and hijacked by the political elites to justify non-democratic structures, right? But it's not the culture per se. There's nothing in Islam or nothing in Hinduism or nothing in Buddhism, so on and so forth, right? That prevents democracy from taking root. Remember? Everybody remember this argument, right? So the logic is that no, culture doesn't really stand in the way, right? Right. There's strong evidence for democracy or democratization in a lot of Asian countries, right? And also, you always see the logic, right? That they say that those that are in Muslim countries, right? They are this is where you don't see democracy taking root. But this Pew Global research, it is dated, it's from 2012, right? 10 years ago. But the trend actually remains as it is, right? Following the Arab Spring, right, you will realize, in fact, the Arab Spring itself is an indicator, right, that there actually was a strong pro-democratic uh, desire in a lot of these, Muslim countries, right? So the logic is that, when you look at that survey, right, uh, say for example, right, there was a strong desire in Lebanon, Turkey, Egypt, Tunisia, Jordan, and so on for democratic institutions. They focused on the idea of democratic rights. They wanted competitive elections, free speech, right? And a lot of them feel that the US actually doesn't promote actual democracy in the Middle East. They are trying to promote a particular version that is suitable for US exploitation of the Middle East. And there was also a greater support for the general principle of gender equality. So why is it that the rationale, the question that we asked today, if that's the case, right, why is it that we still see a lot of authoritarian structures or less than democratic structures or struggles to establish democratic structures in a lot of these, non-Western countries like in the Middle East and so on? That is largely because there are impediments to democracy in the form of existing authoritarian leaders, or there are impediments in the sense that people want democracy, but how do they implement it? So the cementing of this desire for democracy, right, doesn't translate into strong institutions, not just yet at least. You have political parties or you have politicians that are corrupt, you have poor governance, you may have weak institutions, and all of this in combination, right, goes towards the suppression and oppression of democracy. But that doesn't mean people don't want democracy. There's a difference between the two. People are satisfied with these authoritarian institutions, then why did you see Arab Spring? Why did you see struggles still, right, to establish democratic institutions? So that is one major, argument that we need to dispel. Second argument that we need to dispel also is that the Western media consistently depicts Asians or non-Westerners as being less than enthusiastic about democracy. So does that, according to them, right, that means Europe and West is the epitome of democracy. Are the Westerners always enthusiastic? Answer is no. Surveys also reveal otherwise. There's a growing disillusionment among a lot of European countries, in Latin America, in USA, in countries like Australia, and so on, right? That actually dissatisfaction and disaffection have been taking place, right? So I've given you the links, right? If you look at the first one, it's a Straits Times article, right? But the logic here is that the number one causes, and it holds still right up till today, right? Number one causes for dissatisfaction in the US for democracy is economic stagnation, rising inequalities, growing political power of the rich. The number of times that you see on social media today complaining about individuals like billionaires like Jeff Bezos and what's his name? The Tesla fellow. What's his name? Elon Musk, right? And comments like "eat the rich," "tax the rich." Salaries have remained stagnant, but inflation has gone up, rent has gone up, prices of goods have gone up, and so on, right? So people are very dissatisfied. Dissatisfaction is very high, right? And there's, a very high level of dissatisfaction with the way the last two governments, right? Um, Dissatisfaction with Obama, dissatisfaction with Trump, dissatisfaction with Obama increased as a result of, all the comments by Trump, okay? And then subsequently dissatisfaction with Biden, right, as a result of some of these promises, electoral promises not being kept. Like say, for example, Biden promised to, annihilate student debt, but it hasn't materialized yet. So it is not just Asian countries or Middle Eastern countries that experience dissatisfaction in democracy, but also in these Western countries as well. So please do not jump to conclusion, which a lot of media actually does, to say that no, non-Western countries are where you do not see democracy taking root and where you see, people being very highly dissatisfied. It happens in the US as well. It happens in Latin America. It happens in Australia and Canada, right? New Zealand. There's dissatisfaction everywhere. Okay? All right. So it's not restricted. So you cannot blame cultural values, right? And say that this is the reason why democratic institutions don't work. Right? This is why people are dissatisfied. It's because of the culture. And it's not true. If it's because of the culture, then you should always see very high levels of satisfaction and democracy in the US, in Latin America, in Australia, in Canada, and Nordic countries, and so on. Why is it that we see a discrepancy? So culture is not the only reason why you have got dissatisfaction in democracy. Right? Okay. The question about the Myanmar one is a bit complicated because this one is coming down to basically people hiding their feelings as a result of not wanting to face persecution. It's difficult to answer this question at this point because saying yes or no would basically be saying that I have inside information on what people are actually thinking. So I think it is taking it's a bit of a stretch of the argument already, right? Some, unless there's consistent evidence to say that people are lying, that's tantamount to what the question is, right? People are claiming that they're satisfied with the authoritarian regime to avoid persecution, right? So how do we prove that, or how do we justify that? Where do you get the information from to justify that argument? So it's a bit difficult for me to answer that question, right? Because you need to have adequate evidence. They'll be jumping into conclusion. All right. Second argument about the age of democracy, right? Is really the logic about new or established democracies, right? Can we jump into a conclusion to say that those that are newer democracies or those that are newly established, right? It will definitely be proving to be a scenario where citizens are very satisfied, or definitely proved to be a scenario where they are very dissatisfied. Logic here is that it can go two ways, right? Very importantly is that what you need to think about, right, is that when you have a newly democratizing structure, right, it can go two ways. Why? Because number one, you can have very high levels of satisfaction, democracy, because you may have citizens who are saying that, look, this whatever that we are having right now, whether the elections are really free and fair, it doesn't matter. It is way better than what the previous system basically gave us. So they feel that whatever we have right now is much better than what we had before, and therefore we're very satisfied with the way the institutions are functioning. And because they're so satisfied, they fervently embrace these democratic ideals, right? And they support any kind of fledgling institutions. And when they support these fledgling institutions, you're going to see, at least in the initial years, a higher level of support for democracy, right? So that is what you're going to see. So the rationale is that sometimes some theorists like Arts and Thomason, Lind, and Ackerman, they will say that, okay, in order for these institutions, in order for us to say that we're satisfied with, the ideals of democracy, and we're satisfied with the way these institutions are performing, right? The institutions must perform well first, right? Only if you consistently deliver, democratic uh, 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 results, and only if you deliver economic results, then people will be satisfied. But then it can go two ways. I can be satisfied only if I see results, number one. But I can also be very satisfied if I say, this is way better than what I have. So I'm going to support it anyway. I may not actually see results yet, but I support it because it is better than what I have seen before. So it can go two ways, right? You can have high levels of enthusiasm, right, as a result of seeing the results, or you can have high levels of enthusiasm as a result of, saying that this is better than before, and we will see results, in the long term if we continue to support it. Understand this argument down here? Everybody clear? Everybody clear? Right? The faith in democracy versus results. So for some people, they need to see the results in order to express satisfaction. And for results to actually occur, they need to actually be established for a while, right? Because results are not overnight, right? But you can also see high levels of satisfaction immediately because they have faith that these democratic institutions are going to work, and they have faith that these democratic institutions are actually better than what they used to be. That means anything is better than the non-democratic institutions that we used to see before, right? You understand the argument? So it can go both ways. You're not going to get one answer always, just like how we don't get one answer always when we say that non-Western countries are always going to be having lower levels of satisfaction, or less developed countries are always always going to have less levels of satisfaction. It depends. It really depends. A lot of these arguments, right, actually go two ways. It depends on what the context is. That's why at the very beginning of the lecture, I established the context is very important. Understand? Are we all clear on this argument? Everybody? Any questions? People? Hello? Okay, all clear. All right. What I'm going to do, what's the time? Okay, it's 2:52. I've got 4 more slides to go, but that's on the second point. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to deal with this next week, right? Because next week we are going to do argument 3 and 4 anyway, right? So I will do argument 2 next week as well, okay? All right, because I rather than to rush it right now, right? I will just do argument 2 next week, okay? So that means next week's lecture, I will start from point 2, which is slide 39. All right, and then I will continue on with lecture 21 set of slides. Can we do that? Okay. Okay, can we do that? Yeah. Okay. Also, my throat is killing me already. All right. Okay, let me just answer Amanda's question before we end. Okay, we have to talk about satisfaction with democracy on countries that have been democratized, but not like countries like China because they're not democratized. Amanda, right, you do realize that while countries that are not democratized, like China, right, they do claim to have democratic institutions, right? Right. Okay. So the logic is that they are Russia and China will be considered to be countries um, that have some fledgling democratic institutions. Like there are elections in China, but you can't call China democratic per se, right? Because elections also only until a particular level. Russia has political parties and they have elections, but there's a lot of funny things that happens during their elections as well, right? Like political parties are not allowed to go and campaign in particular regions and so on, right? So Russia and China, largely considered by the West as non-democratic, Some theorists consider them to be stuck in the gray zone, where they have attempted to democratize, or they've attempted, no, sorry, wrong word. They've attempted to institutionalize some democratic institutions, but they have not progressed, they've not moved forward. But yet, people sometimes have satisfaction with the institutions, right, that deliver, right? So that is, it's not satisfaction in democracy per se, right? But it is satisfaction with the way the institutions are functioning. So that's why we include them in the discussion down here. But largely, I would say, if you want to steer clear, Amanda, if you want to stay clear of this confusion, right, then look specifically at countries that are democratizing, like those that are in the Middle East, versus, say, like your traditional democratic countries like the West. Amanda, does that answer your question? Yeah. Okay. All right. In that case, I will see you all next week. I should be better next week, right? So I will see you all in class, lah. Right? Okay. I don't think I mean, if I'm still not well, right, then okay. See, the reason here is that I decided to put everything online because I think it's uncomfortable for people to be hearing me coughing, right? And then people might think I got COVID, and then if somebody catches something from somewhere else, or even if you just get a normal cough, right? Then it may be a case where it impacts your revision, right? So that's why I put things online. So I think I should be better next week, right? So look out for announcement, lah. But I think I will see you all in class. Okay. All right. See you all. Bye bye. Thank you. All right. Thank you. Take care. Bye bye. Bye. Yeah, New Year. I saw.